This is Life Worlds, the place where we explore life through other eyes and minds. Let's flip the script and discover how to orient your world around nature. I'm Alexa Firmenich. Come join me as we get down and forage for fungi, stalk coyotes, draft laws for rivers, hum with beehives, sing bird language, and help beavers to dam again. Let these stories spark your reconnection to nature's multiverse. Learn how to bring ecosystems back to life, become an agent for other intelligences, and begin to see how you too are the sum of all life worlds. Hello, Life Worlds friends. This episode is all about the small and mighty, the lesser-known heroes of our planet and the Earth's biosphere. We often hear about the charismatic ambassadors of nature, the pandas, whales, eagles, lions of the world, and we love them for the magnetism they exert in the collective imagination. But today I'm going to provoke us to consider the more invisible ones that hold and stitch our planet together, and how working alongside them can be one of the most effective tools for holistic landscape conservation and new economic models that provide livelihoods for the thousands of stewards of natural systems. Dum dum dum. Enter the stingless bee, a 65 million year old ancestor here on planet Earth. The oldest bees on the planet, who buzzed and darted around when the dinosaurs were still roaming the continental plates. These fuzzy little creatures express themselves in over 600 distinct species and come in all shapes, sizes, and colors, like golden or solid onyx or striped dandelion. Take Angelita, the tiny one, smallest of all. She travels barely a breath's distance from home, maybe 20 to 100 meters at max, and her honey is dark and thick. Or let's have Melipona, the royal engineer, architect of the most complex hives. She builds in tiers and chambers like a cathedral, replete with nurseries, pantries, even cemeteries. And then you have Trigona, the resin keeper, drawn to the dragon blood tree, carrying its deep red tears back in her pollen pouches. These stingless bees make home in all the tropical forests of the world, and yet most of us remain unaware they even exist. And admittedly, I didn't know about them as well. And so we're going to zoom in on where today's episode takes place, deep in the heaving, breathing lungs of the Amazon rainforest. Nearly half of stingless bee species have been detected in the Amazon. And as you might imagine, over these 65 million years, they've developed incredibly entangled and intricate relationships with the thousands of other species that reside and grow in the forests. That very entanglement is a key point that we're going to discuss today. Possibly the most amazing thing about the stingless bees are the honeys that they produce. Now, unlike their counterpart, the Western honeybee, stingless bees are more picky in terms of what plants they pollinate, and due to these millions of years of relationships, are infinitely more skilled at pollinating indigenous plants in very specific symbiotic relationships, honed and honed and honed over time. And because the Amazon is basically one massive living pharmacy, this means that the stingless bees are drinking from a huge variety of native plants that contain rich medical properties. Now, these are properties that we are only beginning to decode, and they're making it into the honey, endowing the honey with some what might turn miracle properties. Now, for example, they'll make honey with chemicals that ward off microbial and fungal growth, an adaptation that keeps honey from spoiling in the humid heat. Now, that honey quality obviously translates into those who then drink it. And so the microbial and fungal properties are translated from the honey to our very own microbiome. And so hence, their honey has been used for centuries by many indigenous peoples as a natural medicine for all kinds of ailments and conditions. Now, not only is it about the honey, but the presence of the bees is also essential to the health of the rainforest itself as vital pollinators, propagating all sorts of plants and crops. And yet, both the bees and the forest they depend upon are under threat. The Amazon itself, as you might know, edging towards a tipping point that scientists warn could be irreversible. And so, protecting the bees protects the forests, and protecting the forest protects the bees. The bees offer the forest something truly critical because the medicinal honey they produce and their pollination work could provide, in the longer term, a very important source of income for local communities and indigenous groups, which can help them offset the financial pressures from extractive industries to instead cut down the forest. So you can kind of imagine that stingless bee preservation is like a portal or a gateway where one iconic species can safeguard many species and rainforests at a vast scale, all the while honoring indigenous wisdom and traditional medicine. Now, today we are speaking with Dr. Rosa Vasquez Espinosa, a chemical biologist, conservation leader, and National Geographic explorer leading the global movement protecting wild pollinators and the Amazon. She's founder and executive director of Amazon Research International, and her leadership has been recognized by pretty much every global news outlet and multiple scientific bodies. Amazon Research International is working across science, policy, economics, and large-scale conservation with the bees as their allies. For example, they're developing the first large-scale stingless bee mapping initiative in the Peruvian Amazon to lay the foundation for the first proposed bee conservation corridor all across the Pan-Amazon region. They then combine this with indigenous-led bee sanctuaries, medicinal gardens, capacity-building programs, and more, including the first female-focused initiative that we'll talk about today, Las Meli Bonicultoras, working with hundreds of indigenous women trained in distributing hives across Peru and Bolivia. Now, her NGO also worked tirelessly to have Peru enact a law in January 2025 that was a historic turning point because for the first time, stingless bees were formally recognized as a native species of Peru, establishing the national legal foundation for their protection. This would have been impossible without multi-year research that they did identifying gaps in cultural documentation. And then building on this in 2025, 2 municipalities formally recognized the legal rights of stingless bees in their ecosystems, which was actually the first known legal recognition of the rights of an insect anywhere in the world. So Amazon Research then leverages those novel legal and scientific bases to build new supply chains for the bioeconomy from the forest floor up, selling the highly medicinal honey as an economic alternative to deforestation. And due to their work, the value of native honey in some places has already increased by over 500% due to the scientific validation of the medicinal properties of the honey. Today with Rosa, we're going to delve into this and obviously quite a bit more. We'll discuss what it means to build a conservation movement around a bee that most people have never heard of, how to turn a honey jar into a legal rights case, and what a 65-year-old million-year insect can teach us about the economies we need to build for a regenerative future for the Amazon rainforest. Over to our conversation with Rosa. Rosa, it's such a pleasure to have you on Life Worlds. Welcome. You have beautiful plants in your background for people who are watching on video, bringing the Amazon through the airwaves. How are you today?
Thank you so much, Alexa, for having me. I'm doing good, and it's such a pleasure and honor to be here with you and just kind of get to dive a little deep into this conversation and ways of thinking. I really appreciate how you see the world as well. So I'm excited to have this call.
All right, well, thank you. I like that you're saying dive, and there's this pink dolphin behind you as well.
Yeah.
He wants to dive in as well. So Rosa, I've queued up as usual, as I do in the podcast, quite a lot in the introduction around bees and the context and history and some of your work. And so I think where I'd love to start today is, can you bring us into the life worlds of these bees, almost like if you could tell it from their perspective, like if I am a Amazonian stingless bee of the many species waking up this morning in the jungle, what's my day like? What kind of patterns do I have? What's my family life like? My home, my behaviors. Maybe you can tell it from the perspective of some of the bees. Like how's your day? How's your life?
Yeah. I love that. I actually haven't been asked that, but it's something we do talk constantly with our communities, and even kind of do some games where we get to talk to the bees as well. And that was actually quite key for us to kind of get the language that everybody was happy with for the Rights of Nature work. And it was just such a fun experience. Stingless bees, for those who have never heard about them, they are the oldest bees on our planet. So they are from the time of the dinosaurs, except that they are still alive. And so from 80 million years ago or so, and they're all around the tropics. In the Amazon, in the areas where we work, they tend to wake up a little later than the we wake up a little later than the Apis mellifera, which is the stinging honeybee. They wake up at like 5. We wake up around maybe like 6, 7. When it starts to get a little warmer. And so by that time, we have different roles, of course, similar and yet also not exactly the same as the typical honeybees. So the workers who are also female are gonna start to go around and see where there is nectar in the flowers. Now, we cannot travel that long, and that is a key differentiator and actually a very important one for all the work. We can only travel sometimes 20 meters, sometimes 100 meters. Some can travel a bit farther, the larger sizes, but right now I'm thinking that I am the Angelita one, which is like the tiniest one. And that is, we can only travel very small distances. So if we're lucky, we'll have a thriving forest around and then can go to even, tens, if not hundreds of different flowers, but also tree barks. So there are certain trees like the dragon blood tree that we love, that they use this kind of deep, dark red resin, and we can carry droplets of that thick resin in our pockets where we typically would carry pollen back to our hives. And it's a very medicinal resin. People are already using it kind of quite broadly. We use it too. And that's also kind of a key superpower. And then back in the hive, similar to other kind of bees, there are dances that happened to be able to show the other ones where they can go to keep finding this food. The queen, of course, it's such a key leadership within the hive. Now, we stingless bees have princesses on reserve, which is something that's also really unique and key. So there's about 10 to 12 princesses on reserve at all times. So if something happens with the queen, where she's either like dying, or if somebody's trying to replicate our hive to do a second hive from us, it's okay if they don't take the queen. And that's so different because in the typical bees we're used to, hearing about the honeybees, if you don't bring the queen along, the hive will die. With thousands of bees, it just won't make it. With the stingless bees, it will still make it because one of the princesses will be able to tell that the queen is not around and then become a queen. And that's just kind of so beautiful. Then in our homes, we have a few different layers, and the bottom one is where we have, how do you say in English? Like, it's en basurero in Spanish, like where we put the trash or where we kind of bury things that we know is going to harm the rest of the hive. And so if an invader is trying to come, like an ant or a little worm, the different bees are going to really kind of, get on it and then take it all the way down to this basurero, to this trash section, or the cemetery as well, and then bury it under sand and dust and other different things. So we keep the whole hive really functional. So everybody has their own role, but it's towards this larger common mission. And then at the end of the day, we just all kind of come back and our hive sounds the strongest than ever because everybody's back in. So it sounds really like somebody has turned on a radio. And that is actually something key as well, so that the humans can find us when we are in the rainforest, because we tend to do our hives inside a tree. So it's really hard to find us as another protective mechanism. But then the humans that have been living with the rainforest for a long time have a very acute ear, so that they can follow our sounds. And then with many of them, we have relationships because they take care of us. And so we can recognize many of them. The science from that, it's quite complex and still developing, but we can recognize, develop relationships. Some of them keep us in their house, and so we can keep their house safe. And then we enjoy, interacting with their children too. And and then that was a really good, happy day.
It's like some funny Disney movie where you have princesses on reserve. I wonder how you could make some kind of animation from that. I love what you're saying.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
I love what you were saying there about the so if you're still one of these Angelita bees, and I'm a human. And I'm a human who has coexisted with you for centuries. So I may be one of the indigenous communities of the Amazon. And you alluded to that in your book, where you had a colleague who the bees were swarming around him, but they really calmed down and they recognized him, and how the frequency of the human, it's like with horses or other creatures, right? The frequency of the human can be recognized by the bees. And I think in the book you even use the word family. So let's say I'm a family member of the hive, of the bee in human form. What coexistences have we developed over time? And I'm thinking specifically, you mentioned some of the medicinal uses of the honey that we'll get to in a while, because of the massive implications that has for Amazonian protection and conservation. But also, I was quite astounded to read in some of your work that the bees actually increase the crop yields of I don't know if that's now more modern industrial crops or more ancient indigenous crops, but I wonder, let's say I'm a farmer human, how do we interact with each other's systems?
So as bees, we do have a long-standing relationship with Amazonians. Even earlier than when the first written records about the Amazon were made in the 1500s from European explorers. And the relationship is, I do believe, is mutual. So on one side, they are keeping plants and trees and flowers around us, and they are keeping the waters clean. And then I know this is a bit more idyllic because there's a lot of negative things happening, but there's also a lot of hopeful things happening. And so they are coming to visit us. Some are keeping us behind their houses whenever we lose the trees where we can nest. And so they're giving us homes where they're not kicking us out, but rather just keeping us there safely. They clean our hives so we can produce more honey and produce more larvae and increase our populations. And then in the reciprocity aspect, they take the surplus honey that we're making, which is not just our food and medicine, but it's also their food and medicine. And in some areas, the most important medicine and the most important nutrition children get. And then also in exchange, we get to help strengthen the yields. The work that we primarily have done is with local crops, where we can improve the production by 45%, which is huge. And there are some areas where people, narrate that the soils had dried up so much that they couldn't grow anything. Nothing was growing. That was just, tierra seca, nothing grows there. And then they started to keep us bees to be able to get some honey. And then unexpectedly, over the next few months, at some point, they started to see a plant grow. They started to see fruits come back to life in ways that they never expected us. So now they also keep us to be able to have access to those flowers and medicines and fruits. But we also visit other key crops that do have high value for the rest of the world. The work still kind of, the sciences, we're just getting more started on that, but that includes coffee, and that includes avocado and blueberry and cacao as well. Because we come in so many different sizes than the typical bee, then we are so much more versatile. And because we are so ancestral, we really have developed our genetics and our behaviors co-evolving with plants around our planet. So like, our ability is just insane. And then, so the humans get the crop increase, the medicinal honey. But it's also a relationship. I think they also feel safe with us because we signify, ancestry and sacredness and guidance. And then they can teach their kids how to behave like us. So we are being kind of like their teachers too. There is a lot of spirituality around for many of the human relatives. Their entire worldviews is based on us. And so if we disappear, that glass shatters, that entire thread of seeing the world just kind of goes. So there's mutual benefits in relationships.
It's so beautiful. And, this was what really struck me. Now I'll address you as Rosa. What really, but you can still be a bee, but you're also Rosa. All of it. What really struck me when I came across your work is how profoundly holistic it is. And, many people who have listened to the podcast already, they'll have come across the concepts of like a keystone species or a symbolic species whose health represents a whole ecosystem. It could be a whale, it could be a wolf, it could be a beaver. We spoke about that some of the rewilding episodes. But in this case, what I've understood about your work with Amazon Research International, which is your NGO, is that you're working alongside the bees as sort of symbolic species, they represent the holistic health of the ecosystem. And so when the bees are present, it shows that there is an intact forest, and all of the different parts of that forest are in, let's say, a relative degree of harmony, right? The pollination, the water, so on and so forth. And we'll touch on these aspects of your work sort of in order, but you've linked the bees and the health of the ecosystem to politics, to economics, to human rights. And I think that's quite unique, actually, in the conservation world. I don't think we see many people being that holistic. And maybe if we can just start with the first aspect, which is conservation, right? And your foundation, you've started to lay the roots for one of the first sort of pan-Andean corridors, conservation corridors of stingless bees. And people who are listening, that might be akin to what you do in a city. It's like a pollinator pathway, but this is like the multi-country, super like wild version of it. And because the bees connect the landscapes, connecting the bees, connecting and protecting the bees, protects the forests. And so to do that, we have to know where the bees are. And so you've been mapping where the bees are. And I'm really, really curious to ask you, like, no one's really done this before. So what does it take for you and your team as scientists and as practitioners to know where the bees are, to map them? Like, what capacities do you even have to develop to be able to do that well? And then maybe as a follow-on question or within that, like, what surprised you in that process of like having to map, having to follow them and understand them? Or maybe even some of the results were surprising, but I'm just very curious about that piece.
So thank you so much. That was very kind for you to say. And I think that is I find it difficult to understand when I see only one side of something. Since I'm a child, I need to kind of understand, well, what's going to happen if, and then what's going to happen then, and how it connects to that for me to even kind of just be able to follow through. So that's just my own way of seeing the world. Now, quickly, when I first came to contact with stingless bees, it was meant to be this one science and storytelling project, and that's it. It had a beginning and an end in my head. But then in that short period of first contact, I just saw so quickly all of these other branches, from the connection with people, the spirituality, the ecology, and then the idea that we have completely neglected the oldest bee pollinator in our planet, and seeing, all of the predictions of what's going to happen with the planet, with climate change, and even seeing the projects that succeed and that equally fail in the Amazon rainforest. It just kind of blew my mind. how no one had ever done anything about it. And by listening, which is something I think we do good, in the Amazon is being so typical. And in the Andes, Amazonian and Andes, I see them kind of really intertwined because they've co-developed together. I mean, literally the Amazon kind of gets born from the Andes, right? And even culturally, a lot of the people, although there are, different territories for different indigenous groups, really, we've all just kind of, there's a lot of similarities around, and a lot of people that have mixed families as well, including mine. And so, by listening to people, the very first thing that people would say, besides like, oh, the honey is so medicinal, is they are disappearing. And there was like a deep sense of fear and like hopelessness that I could see in the eyes. And this is a short span of time of conversation. So, that indicated I was really present in their mind and really in the forefront of thinking. And then that just kind of led us to talk with different groups. That was one of the first things that I did, from reaching out with cold messages to the IUCN, to local authorities. What have we missed, and what do we need to do something about it? And the idea that we had no clue where the stingless bees even were was a key problem. And so then we looked at, well, exactly what you're saying. What do we need to actually do it? And when we first started a pilot with it, I understood why nobody had done it yet. And so, and then also why modern science alone, it was never going to be the answer. There's no way that could have been the only answer. So I think it really required people that could bring the different knowledge, ways of seeing the world and understanding it through indigenous knowledges to even be able to solve this as a problem. So we did a small pilot with Ashaninka people, and there's this amazing Ashaninka scientist. He's become a published scientist with our work now, Richard Demetrio, that was also a beekeeper, had deep knowledge with the bees, and was really keen to kind of just test this out. So I put some methods together, just kind of inspired or just general mapping species work, but knowing that we were going to have to adapt to a lot of things. The Amazon is fluid. The Andes is fluid as well. And so we literally just took different equipments. We're going to also test how they were going to do in these extreme conditions, the equipments themselves, and understand that we couldn't just develop a simple grid as people typically would and walking path and then just, we're just going to happen to see the bees and that's going to be the best method. No, we had to kind of completely reshift that and first see the world through the eyes of the beekeepers, then even find them. And even within the beekeepers, there are some that are, and there's different explanations to this, that are deemed as like, they have the eye or they have the ear to be able to even find the stingless bees in the wild. And so we basically just walk the path with them at the beginning, literally saying, show me how you're finding the stingless bees. And that change between locations. So with Richard, the Shaninka partner, he primarily finds them in the higher altitudes of Amazon Andes corridors, and he finds them during the day. So he just goes and the acuity in his eyes, I mean, it's just something like I've never seen before. He'll be able to pinpoint this tiny little entry by being able to follow the bees, although it's a ocean of green trees around. And it's absolutely surreal. Then in the north, for example, which is where we have Kukama partners, they only find the stingless bees in the night. So that requires us to kind of switch our approach and then just first go at night with them to the, to the forests and learn to train our ear to be able to follow the sound of the stingless bees, which is also a whole other ordeal. And then in that process, also, once you do get to the bee, if we only followed the modern science to be able to identify the bee, there's even not that much data out there. You do genetics, there's not that much data to actually get to your answer quickly, and it's ridiculously expensive and not feasible for the field at this moment with that. Or if you do typical taxonomical studies, it can take a long time. At the beginning, how do you make it more feasible? And we learned that indigenous people had actually had their own taxonomy. I'm going to call it indigenous taxonomy, which is where they could basically kind of distinguish between species, or at least genus, by the little door entry that they have to the hives. So the bees make a specific entry to the hives that actually looks different to one another. And they notice that this one bee kind of bee was making this specific entry. And when we compare that to already published taxonomical work, they were really accurate. And so suddenly then that becomes a way in which we can prioritize how we do this work in a way that is feasible, that is quick, that is cost efficient, and that involves them as well. And I think that was also another part of this work. We could have never been able to even get this started if we didn't have indigenous partners that wanted to become scientists with. And I think that is something that we haven't typically seen in these territories, that we reserve the more modern science to those with a full formal degree or that come from somewhere outside, not even opening the door that maybe the people from the territories want to learn as well. And that was just something I think that just started with dialogue and again, just with the listening. And so by incorporating them is how we started the pilot. And it's a lot of effort. Sometimes you can go for 7 hours out hiking in the territories and not find a bee. So you can have a full day of work and not even find a single hive. Sometimes you're lucky and you can find multiple. So then that really has to become long term. And, it's not necessarily that somebody's going to be 24/7 finding the bees. People also have work and have other things to do. So we had to also pair it up together with other activities that they had and just kind of make it more culturally adaptable. And with that, we've been able to map close to 400, 500 hives right now across quite a lot of hundreds of hectares. Which is very exciting. Each hive has somewhere between 2,000 to 5,000 bees. So we're at the million number of bees, which is really beautiful. We are expanding. And one of the main goals for us was, if they're disappearing, then we need clever ways to protect it, starting with a corridor that serves multiple purposes. And, all the other amazing data that we can get from this work by doing it physically and not just through satellite or something, we can also understand what trees these bees like to nest in. And if we have that data, so far with the pilots, we've seen there's a statistical relevance. So bees prefer certain kind of trees to be in. By having that information, we can actually then generate guides whenever somebody's doing reforestation. If you want it to be bee friendly, which it should be, at least introduce these ones. The same for monitoring illegal trafficking of trees. Have better, monitoring on these lists. And so we've already talked with the authorities as well, who are really also quite happy to see the data. They many times don't even have access to this scientific data or the funding to even do it. So whenever we have more compiled results, they'll be really keen to implement it as like national regulations.
I think it's really not to be underestimated, like the skills of some of the people you mentioned, like the bee whisperers, the bee listeners, like people who can be so attuned that they can like detect that little. It reminds me when I've been with like my friends who are like hunters, or when I've been with people, on a sardine run, and you're trying to find where the sardine bowls are, and they can read that, they can detect like the surface of the ocean and just like these minute signs. And today I think so many people speak about like nature reconnection, or how do we bring people back into contact. And I really think that's, this is science that you're describing. It's Western science, it's indigenous science, but the act of like searching for other beings and species and understanding their patterns and their life ways, it's a way of honing people's sensitivity to nature and like deep interconnection. There was a part of your book that I think it was in the nighttime you were searching for the bees, and I'll just quote from your book, but you said, it's like a radio had been turned on and you couldn't help but focus on one particular channel, following sounds in the pitch black darkness. We'd attuned our senses to the symphony of the rainforest to find a needle in a haystack, bees living inside the tree trunks. And I think that like sensorial acuity, or I think of Juniela Furci, when she's looking for the fungi and something calls to her and she finds this fungi over there. The people you've been working with the communities or the scientists you've been bringing, do you see that over time, this relationship of mapping and sensing and even taking, working with the data, does it change people? Like, does it change the people you're working with, either the communities or the scientists you're bringing?
Yes. Especially, I think in the last year or so, we've been able to integrate more people, both Peruvians from these territories and from the cities, as well as internationals. And I think by just virtue of spending a little bit of time with the stingless bees, people end up kind of even talking a little bit more humanistic about them, or being like, oh, what does the bee need? Just the whole perspective, you recognize they're just more than just an insect. There is so much something deeper. And I think also by anyone that has not lived with them comes and see the relationship that the locals have, whether it's the beekeepers or now the scientists within the territories, or even the leaders or the women or the children. They understand this is again, is more than just an animal that's giving them honey. This is a companion. It's just a relative. And so the word becomes so much more prominent. And that equity that you mentioned, I mean, if we look back at the development, the evolution even of our species, it just makes so much sense that that's how we survive. We had to be so attuned to our senses to be able to read the changes in the weather and the landscapes and even the movement of the herds of the animals. Of course, now a big majority or a big percentage of the population is living very highly modern lives, and we are within four walls. And there's even a study that came out earlier this year that says that in some capital cities, children spend less than 4 minutes out there with nature, less than 4 minutes a day. So how, I do believe that there's so many senses, many we're aware of, many we are not aware of, that have their, again, like the bees have co-evolved with flowers, that have co-evolved with their being out, in connection with nature. And then some of these territories, they still keep that really intact. And that's why they can hear a sound from so much farther than I ever thought I could, ever, or being able to identify that needle in the haystack in ways that a whole other group of 20 people, even with binoculars, is not going to be able to. And there's something to say about that,
Yeah, I think it makes such a case also for citizen science, not just on the sort of technical level, but on the actual like mindset, cultural shift level. Like if we get more and more people, what people do with Pokemon Go, but doing it for other beings, it kind of creates that. I've seen some initiatives like that. And so if we move to the economics bit, because you spoke earlier about the sort of, I'll use the industry jargon, but the ecosystem services, right? That these beings create in the landscape. So it could be pollination services. It could be, in this case, it's probably mostly pollination, but the fact that the trees are healthy means that you have healthier water cycles, carbon biodiversity, etc. I know there's a big tension inside of many practitioners of, let's say, nature restoration protection, where we shouldn't put a value on nature, we shouldn't quantify, et cetera, and that sort of reducing the sacredness of spirituality. I used to be a bit more in that camp, but then I think there's also the very valid argument that we live inside of a current economic political system that values numbers and dollar signs, and communities need income in their pockets to prevent them from, unfortunately, having to sometimes be extractive because they have no other viable alternative. So I'm curious, in your experience, you and your partners have been starting to build nature-based economies, or let's say bioeconomies, around the stingless bees, and as a way to fight deforestation. I'd love to hear you speak about the economic angle of it, your sort of relationship to that economics, and how is it affecting the communities on the ground? Are there debates about it? Yeah, bring us into that a little bit.
Yeah, and I grew up all my life in Peru, and then I left when I was 18 to attend uni. So for a long period, I kind of was going through Western academia, and I mentioned this because I think along that long journey, I came to understand a bit more of like the westernized mentality, or people that have never been able to be in these territories, and the judgment that may arise, or the thoughts or the doubts and questions that come. And the same on the other side, right? From these territories where we've grown up, the judgment, the questions, and the fears that arise. So I kind of almost could see both. And at some point, and this was definitely kind of even before I started the organization, and definitely part as to why I thought we needed something different. Hearing people conversation of why are they cutting down trees? That's just ridiculous. It makes no sense. It's going to impact their own, development of their soils and fruits. And yet at the same time, we are ultimately talking about a human right. If a family is hungry and if your child has not eaten, you will do anything to make sure that your child has food. And that ultimately is that's what it comes down to. And that is just the reality for many families. And I think talking about ecology without economy is a utopic world that doesn't exist. It maybe exists in advanced, more richer cities. It does not exist in the territory. And the same, I think, talking about science that ends up, accumulating amazing nature-like papers, but doesn't translate into anything else. I think that, that is perhaps a luxury that some countries can have. And the universities I was in, that was the main focus, and that's great. And that's how they do it. When I started to see and going back to Peru, kind of reconnecting what I wanted to do, I was like, that is doing a disservice. That is unjust for me to even think that I can come back and do science in the same way that these other countries are operating. Then I just have learned nothing from my own ancestry. And so I see this development of economics and science in a very parallel way. And I've also, I think, seen, because we did so much research at the beginning just to understand what was the landscape of what's being done, what kind of projects, what kind of organizations, to see if we didn't even need to start an organization. That's not where even we started. We started to can we join something that already exists? And can we just, bring all of our power and ideas there? And we couldn't. But that kind of brought us to really understand what was happening. And we saw so many, that on paper looked like amazing projects that came with so big investments. And the idea overall was great. And I'll give you an example with the paiche. I don't know if you've ever seen that fish. It's like the largest freshwater fish we have in the world. It's called arapaima. It's gigantic. I mean, it can weigh 200 kilograms. It's really so big. And you find it in certain parts of Peru. And there was a project that was intending for locals to grow and raise this fish, because one single of this fish, can generate so much money. And they even had a whole path on bringing, the canned meat from that fish to Whole Foods. So the economic path looked already kind of established. And I believe, I don't know the details, that they did have kind of like a model that would have benefited the local families. So everything looked great. What they failed to, and this is, I think, $1 million project, where they failed was that they didn't either, I don't know exactly if either they didn't have the conversations or they didn't ignore them or something got lost in translation. The fact that these fish need months of being bred and raised. And in that process, nobody's generating any income. And in that process, people need to invest money to even feed that giant fish. And during those months, the families were not making any money. And of course, shortly after, people stopped raising them because they are just putting money out there that they already don't have without seeing their daily needs being met. So I think that was a cultural disalignment and like a basic human rights disalignment, not trying to make anyone look evil, because perhaps that was not the perspective. I don't think so. It's just the disalignment and the lack of dialogue. So in our case, from the get-go, we knew that some people were kind of selling their bee products. But when we started the work, the size of a regular bottled water, so let's say 500 milliliters, would sell for maybe 10 Peruvian soles, $3, because it looks very different and it tastes very different. So when you look at that honey, it looks liquid. And so some people didn't believe that was real honey. Perhaps it was mixed with something else. There was absolutely no value except what the local people were saying that they're using for medicine. So there may even people buying it were other locals that didn't have that honey. When we did the first scientific study, which was to look at what's the chemistry of that stingless bee honey, and with the modern science techniques, just kind of really reconfirm what the indigenous people knew, that there were hundreds of medicinal molecules, such richness in this honey, and share that back in a way that communities understood it and could share it too. So that the empowerment that we saw was insane. To this day, and I'm talking just, less than 5 years, we've seen an increase of at least 500% in the price. So that same bottle can go easily for 20 American dollars or even 30, and even in some instances, even higher than that, 100 American dollars. Not in all the cases and not, as consistent as I think we'll get at some point. But suddenly now some families are making 200 American dollars a month, by a combination of selling the products or even receiving tourists. So a complete shift of now they're able to send their kids to school or improve their facilities and whatnot. So for us, that was really key. And when we were even talking about the rest of our conservation goals, the economic side kept being brought back into the conversation by the communities. That was, I think, one of the biggest dialogues we saw when they had seen what had happened with the rights of nature in a river in Peru. The main fear or questions that arose, as much support as there was for that, was, well, does that mean I cannot fish or I cannot take tourists in that river? So the fear of losing that economical side was so real and very well debated. So in a way, I'm so glad that we were at the beginning of seeing what was happening and unraveling for these other projects. So then from the start, we made sure we made space for that conversation, made space to have economical training in the capacity building around sustainable stingless beekeeping, made space to talk about it when we were talking about rights of nature. And that became a core component as well of ensuring that fair trade is something that is considered within the conservation, that is backed by protocols, by models. And then I think the economical side of bee products is only just kind of getting started. There's a lot of things that are still missing pieces. We're trying to fulfill them as best as we can within our groups. But I think a key aspect was having additional protections, which was for us the rights of nature and biocultural protocols, so that we can do things better, compared to how extractivist things have happened before in South America. And so with this thing in place now, we're literally in that process, in almost this shift. Now, how can we help connect these larger economical powers or markets to these local communities in a way that reshifts power, where now, they are also having a seat at the table?
It's such a fascinating response. And I want to get to the legal part in just a sec, but to make something explicit, I think also for listeners, is that if the honey starts fetching, maybe 5x, 6x what they would sell before, that means that those families have income, so they are incentivized, which they would already want to do, but they're actually economically incentivized now to protect the rainforest, to grow more trees, to plant more of the sort of companion species. And so that income from the honey is the most kind of direct and effective conservation mechanism there could be. I think without going and actually I want to share right now, I was reading some of your documents, and I think it's so cool that you created this female focus initiative called Las Meliponicultoras, which were 280 plus indigenous Ashaninka and Kukamira women who were trained, and you distributed 100 plus hives across them. So I think it's awesome that you're also creating this sort of female-led beekeeping initiative as a part of it. Just a sort of last question on the economics piece, and this is obviously a much longer conversation, but how do you ensure that you don't have perverse incentives from that, so people don't over harvest because the price is going up, or you don't have different types of biopiracy coming in? But I guess it's like what happened with quinoa and so many goods. I think even acai, right? Like we find this super, medicinal food from nature, and then we just apply neoliberal economics to it, and they can become monocultures, etc. So how do you guys start to think about the responsibility as the price grows and as people can actually really start to market this more nationally and globally?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll mention on Las Meliponicultoras, we've doubled those numbers ever since, which is fantastic. And the reason why we even kind of came up with that name, because we receive, women, men, children, and youth in the programs. But we noticed that most of the economical programs or trainings in these territories is typically not it welcomes more men. More men just come for many reasons, and many of them being cultural, or even the aspect that the training program arrives to the territory and, oh, somebody needs to cook. And just by virtue of, the structures, the women end up being the ones that are cooking if that component has not been thought about in advance, that somebody brings a cook so that they can also attend a training. So by calling it Las Manipulicultoras and having kind of different women at the forefront, we noticed that more women were, being a lot more confident to approach us, to be kind of engaging in the conversation, and that any community that does stingless beekeeping, there's usually a few that are the main leaders, women or men, but ultimately a lot of the women end up doing the kind of long-term caring. So the men may go to harvest the rice, who stays after to look at the hives, and they were just not receiving the training. And we have seen such incredible development in some of our partners. There was this, my friend Micaela, who is an Ashaninka woman, who says, before she saw herself as a mother and then a community member, now, with the bees, she feels like she's a boss, which is beautiful, and like a leader, so on the economical side, it's multi-layer. One, and I'll start with this, is I think the bees have their own self-defense mechanism, in the sense that stingless bees are fragile. If they don't have the food around them, they will leave, or the hive won't make it. If they don't have any honey left for them, they also won't make it, or they will just leave. So if one is not taking proper care of them, the hive just won't make it. And we've seen this happen as well, where people have, I'm going to invest this, I'm going to put 300 hives because I want to collect all, the honey. Their hives didn't survive more than a few months. They only had 3 remaining hives that they actually brought to one of our communities, because they were like, we failed. And I'm like, well, you guys just didn't listen, so there is an aspect of that I almost think is a bit of irony that happens. The other one is like I said, the bees cannot travel that far distances. So yes, the immediate rainforest around has got to be protected. And then I don't know if there is much kind of detailed data on these stingless bees being kept anywhere. I think we have more empirical data, but some people keeping them, in a city where there's maybe like 1 or 2 flowers nearby, or more in monocultures, where the honey ends up looking, I will put my hands on fire, that is going to look completely different, because the studies we have so far show this high range of medicinal components, which is, I think, what's quite key for the stingless bee honey, and even for the flavor. Based on the diversity of the flowers that they have around. So the agroforestry systems, or just the kind of primary or secondary rainforest with this variety of trees and flowers, are what end up making that honey more medicinal and unique, and why that value is higher than other kinds of honey. So I think that is another component. We've heard from groups taking stingless bees from other countries, trying to take them to even places where they are not native to, Tokyo, Israel, and a few others, and that the hives have not made it. That's what we've heard. I don't have the data firsthand, but that the hives just did not make it. Because once they get there, they just don't have the flora that they're adapted to. And again, they're fragile. So I think that fragility plays good in a way. The other aspect, the biopiracy, we've heard in other countries, and I think this is in Thailand, that because stingless bee honey there is already increasing in prices, some people are taking honey from other non-native, non-stingless bees, mixing it with a little bit of water or something, so it makes it more liquid, it appears, and then selling it like that. So that, as a country, they will need to have stronger regulations and stronger ways to be able to test. Because they already have a few technical norms that allow them to commercialize much faster than Peru, we can kind of see those lessons, and we're already trying to bring that conversation. What can we do from now to be prepared for that? So that, means finding differentiators in that honey where with a quick test, you can tell whether it's actually stingless bee honey or not. So we are in the process of that. And then there's a few key sugars that we're hoping we can kind of land on that are going to be unique to that stingless bee honey, to be able to tell that it comes from that right origin. I think you also need quite a strong connection there with the associations and with the government. So part of we're in the process of design is that there is a green stamp to show the honey that is coming from these, cloud forests, Amazonian Andean corridors. So that it demonstrates that it's actively being, harvested by the indigenous communities and kept by them and benefiting them. The same with any other trusted partners, because even as our work is getting more known, we also now hear word that people are saying, oh, we work with, them, but they don't really. And so then we don't know, we cannot really testify for how their methods are or how good they're keeping their bees or how good they're regenerating, because that's what we are doing. And we're also very open with any methods we are having. So anybody can take them and then do as best as they can with it. And then I think the biocultural protocol and rights of nature was key, because that involves the authorities to be able to what permits you may need, what this fair trade will look like, what kind of pricing, because we have that fair trade economical aspect associated to it. And I think that was, for me, quite key, why I even perhaps delayed, at least within our own teams, like looking even farther into quick economics. Because if that was not in place, I just felt it was up for grabs for anyone in Peru. And so now that we have that, now we need to, bring this other aspect, and then also being open to collaborations that are going to be ethical. So, knowing what that will look like. And I'm sure we're going to learn things along the way. We're going to have many lessons, but strengthening the local leadership, making sure that indigenous communities have formalized associations, so they also have that legal authority within themselves, is something key we've been doing. And then long-term thinking, I and my team are only going to be here on this planet for a short amount of time. It is going to be the next ones that are coming, that they need to have that longevity and be able to know from now that, how that they can carry things on, or what does fair trade even look like? What does, fair business looks like? So a lot of that deep training happens with us behind the scenes, with a lot of youth as well from now.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I work a bit in the food and ag space, and you can see that there's like such intelligent conversations happening around traceability, MRV, supply chains, and so in a way, as you mentioned, like Thailand's learning its lessons, you get to benefit, and you're by far not the only people, I think, vulnerable and empowered by these kinds of like bioeconomy models. What I thought was quite interesting was when you were speaking about the bees, and you're like they can be quite fragile, like if they're moved, the range. And I'm like, I don't know. I think a species who's been around for 60 to 80 million years is actually I'm not. Yeah,
but I think that's why their self-defense mechanism. Exactly. They're fragile, and yet somehow they've survived so long. But that's because of that, I think. Yeah.
Exactly. It's like fragility is an interesting word. It's like their fragility is their resilience, like their particularity, especially in this case where they're interacting with human economic systems. It's like they have their own immune defense as a collective against monoculturalization or against hyper extraction. And I just think it's fascinating. And I think as people are thinking about developing bioeconomies, it's like, what are other products that have that own immune response to being over extracted? Like, the Brazil nut famously is another one where like it requires a healthy forest, etc. So just in the time we have, I would love to hear about you mentioned it a little bit now about the rights of nature work. And I think that what was so intelligent about your approach was you pushed for Peru to recognize these stingless bees legally, and they weren't recognized before. And actually the non-native bees were recognized, which is quite shocking. But now they've been recognized in Peru's national biodiversity strategy, and there's regulatory frameworks that are underway. So why was it important for you guys to bring in that legal aspect? And what did you need to kind of make your case to the government in terms of speaking on behalf of the bees? Like, what needed to be gathered and be like, hey, we're speaking for the bees. We want to be represented. What did you have to do for that?
It was from the start. I think, again, we just had so many conversations and quickly learned the beekeepers and communities had no support, no guidance, no nothing. And it just kind of really bothered me. And I was trying to understand why not. Typically, even if it's not perfect systems, they for specific ask, communities can go and ask for some sort of support within the local authorities. But in this case, all the doors were immediately closed. So it felt like there was something bigger. So once the local authorities didn't give us any answers, they were like, no, we have the hands tied. We ended up kind of going up the chain to whoever would talk to us. And that whoever to talk to us meant sending a million letters until people were keen to even chat. But we landed in a key conversation with the Minister of Environment, who said, well, they're not in the national law, so nobody is going to move a finger because there's no legal framework they can hook themselves to or justification. And I was like, oh, well, is there a law about bees then? And then we learned about this law 26305, I think it was, that was passed actually the year when I was born, 1993, and only mentioned the foreign bees, the honeybees. And because of that, all of the programs, national level, local, regional, were based on Apis mellifera, everything in the country for the last few decades. And I just kind of asked afterwards to the specialist. Yes, the European African kind. And so we asked the specialist at the Ministry of Environment, well, if this was to be changed and it included stingless bees, could things look different? And they're like, yes, of course, but that's not going to happen, And so I think I like to say we had the right amount of naivety in the process, because how we understood what it takes and how little we were really, we're completely independent group. Then I don't know if we would have dared to get into the process, which became a 2-year process. And our approach, I knew nothing really about law, but our approach was, well, let's gather what we are good at, which is we have these key scientific data, ours, but also from other incredible colleagues that have been working on this. And there is great indigenous knowledge that we've been documenting with science articles, but also just testimonials and letters and whatnot. And let's just push as hard as we can for these changes. That didn't get us anywhere at the beginning because people were just not bothered. When we started to get by serendipity, really, news out there in the media, especially in international media, like National Geographic magazine and a few others, a few people started to kind of listen, but at least the data was already there. Like that depth, when they opened that first door, was present. And we did that nonstop for 2 years until eventually somebody took it, suggested it has changed in law. Nothing happened. It still not was going up for debate. And then we were just kind of surprised at that the end of 2 years and a half process that they were now debating it close to Christmas 2024. And because by that period, we had already kind of at least try to speak, whether it was with the Congress or their teams or specialists, or at least send letters, whether we receive an answer, with pretty much anyone there that had a decision-making power. They had heard from us at some sort of level. When the time came for the debate, everybody voted in favor. And I think that was surreal to see everybody voting in favor. But at the same time, we were like, you know what? We worked really hard through a long period with nobody knowing and hearing to at least put the information out there. And I think to me, that became so critical to understand there is a unique power in mixing these knowledge systems, because some will hear to these modern science data, some will hear the indigenous knowledge, and some will hear to both. But I think we've done a disservice by only presenting one or the other. And to us, that just kind of became a framework. And that's kind of how we operate, by having this really solid merged foundation. And so that once that happened, that now by that national law, stingless bees were also recognized as the native species. Then we had that legal framework to then start working on the rights of nature approach, which we had parallel to that. And then, 2 local laws approved at the end of last year that recognize not just stingless bees as the native species of Peru, but as beings inherent of rights and their ecosystems as well, right to be regenerated, to have access to healthy flora, to be free of pesticides, to be associated with fair trade as well, and for the indigenous communities that keep them to be recognized as their guardians, and that they have the power to defend them in court if need to be, and all of this larger approach. Which, ultimately, I just think it's kind of developed this framework, which we're hoping, and so far here in other countries who want to be able to take a similar approach, which is really exciting, both in South America and abroad too.
I think it's such a, sometimes rights of nature, which is something that I have covered on the podcast quite a bit, it's not always linked to something like, oh, here's a bioeconomy model and here's a conservation model, and you sort of, people do the laws before there are applicable avenues for that law to actually enforce. I think what's so cool in your case, to be honest, is like you leverage the law to allow you to then leverage all of these other things that are already happening. And I think it's such a cool case of law. Sort of like, I guess, a closing-ish question because of the time. I sort of was like stepping back from all of these questions and feeling like, there's like a through line in your work in a way, probably many through lines, but one of the ones that I detect is you're sort of like elevating the voice or the beingness of these overlooked life forms, right? And in a way, you're also connecting people with unseen worlds. Like the bees can be invisible, but they're tracing like a lattice across these landscapes. And then I was thinking about that as I was reading your book, and there was a part of the book that doesn't have to do with bees necessarily, but you were walking through the jungle at night with your colleagues, looking with kind of UV light or UV torches. And I want to read just a little bit from that chapter. And I like that you said you were tapping into the language of light, and that the language of light may allow us to rediscover the wonders that live on planet Earth, and a dialect we're only beginning to understand, and that those little UV torches were opening a door into a palpable breathing jungle, telling a story in colors and lights, like a show of fireworks with sparks and bursts flying back and forth. These displays transported secret signals and messages that remain inadvertently invisible to the human eye, and that we don't have to travel so far to the edges of the earth to appreciate the mysticism. Sometimes it's all there, and you just need a new approach, like a UV light or luminescence, to unlock what's there. And so I'd love to hear you sort of reflect on whether it's like the unseen worlds because of just, we don't see in UV light, but actually all of these beings in the natural world look entirely different, or whether it's the, little invisible stingless bees. But what have you learned about how to communicate those life worlds to the general public or to certain audiences, to capture care, to capture imagination, to get people involved and engaged?
I guess, to me, I've seen Peru described. Definitely, this was more in my youth, and as I started to learn other languages. I saw our own territories being described through someone else's lens always. And I just felt that there was so much being missed, because my experience was much more nuanced than what was being described, whether it's this, just focus on these larger predators, which makes for great TV, or these very extreme human versus wild type of stories, which again, I understand makes for great TV. And I'm not, saying we don't need that. But I just had this whole other maternal and medicinal and spiritual relationship. And not just me, my mom and my grandmother and generations before them did as well, where the territory is life and you kind of just develop this other sense of being with it. So I think I kind of carried a deep insatisfaction, and as well as a desire to be able to share that. And things only, become clear as you go in time sometimes. But I just ended up championing for this lesser, I think it was reflected in my work of championing for this lesser known, this more ignored species, and then trying to get the world to see it through my eyes. As realistic as I understand the world is, and I have seen some of the worst atrocities that can happen in our territories, I also choose to see it through this hopeful, joyful light, which is the relationship I keep myself with Peru and our territories. And so I try to just kind of convey that. And I think by sitting in between both worlds, the Western world and these more indigenous roots, I understand people just respond to different ways, like even, ways of learning. I have my own ways of learning. I learn through color, and I learn through this interconnectedness. Others learn through sound and through movement and whatnot. So being very aware that one way is not better than the other, and just trying to speak as many languages as we can, because that is doing honor to this higher relationship. So I think That is how we approach it. And then, that means not turning an eye on something, and a cool opportunity for storytelling, or again, highlighting both sets of data that I've noticed is so key to open so many more doors. And also listening. I think, and I go back to that because I think dialogue is something somehow we've forgotten, and we are not able to hold healthy debates in our planet right now, I think, in many senses. And if we can understand what one part of the world is saying, so like, let's say more westernized audience that have never heard of this, but if we can tap into what are they looking for, what are they hoping for, and somebody, ultimately, there's some certain needs that are similar across us in the planet, then we can kind of understand how to be able to present that or share that, or maybe, connect to these, if you care about food, then let me see how this kind of connects with that, or show you, and then you can kind of make, of course, your own conclusions. So again, that just comes from dialogue and not imposing. And I think we typically tend to think of that in one way, but that happens in both ways.
So a very quick follow-up question on that, just in terms of the bees, what have you found? Because actually a lot of the campaigns and the work you've been doing has like garnered attention. What is it that has that especially the sort of like the Western soul in mind, like has latched onto there? What's the secret thing that people want to hear? And I know that some people listen to the podcast are doing conservation initiatives or trying to create campaigns. So just curious, like, what did you find it was effective?
I don't know if it's a single thing, to be honest. I think it's the aspect that when you come, you see there's depth in multiple aspects. I've seen some people resonating, there's a fraction of people resonate to the fact, oh my God, because of these bees, we have coffee and we have avocado and we have blueberries and chocolate. There is a percentage of the population that resonate mostly with that, and then the rest is additional. There are some others that resonate with the fact that, oh, this is the oldest bee of the planet. Wow, that makes so much sense. Or to the fact like, oh, these are considered guardians of the forest. Like that is the key. Or this honey is medicinal. I don't think I've seen one single thing being the most predominant. I think it's just the idea that we are not bringing something superficial forward. We have depth. So the moment something catches your eye, whether it was the photo of me with, thousands of bees on my face or something else, then people can tap into and then kind of navigate to where their interest may lie. So I think that is something I always advocate for, having depth in whatever you're doing, having those roots that people can explore, then that attention just becomes real. I don't know if that's the right answer to what it has garnered attention, but that's why I guess like to think that's why.
And all of those things you mentioned garnered my attention. So maybe I'm just, Rosa, thank you so much. And I'm going to link to your work in the show notes and your organization and all the ways that people can get in touch. I guess as a closing, is there anything that you want to say on behalf of your people, the Amazon, the bees, from that perspective? Any last words that might come to you?
No, I appreciate the conversation, and I think just tapping in the inherent kind of intuition and skills and talents or questions. I think we ignore that by thinking, oh, we need to focus on this, or this is what things should look like. But when we listen to that kind of where we think our mission is, or that inherent questions that just come, I think something unique comes. And that's something that we did inadvertently, not knowing, no safety net, not knowing nothing. And we are showing that, things can be different. You don't need to be this super insane power to actually make a difference. We've done hyper local work and somehow are reaching global impact. And I think my way of seeing how we change the world is you change the world around you. And if we just share that more broadly, then I think more people would have a bigger sense that they can also do something and not feel hopelessness or lonely, which I think is an epidemic in the planet right now. So yeah, I think that's all I would say. I do think there is hope, and then just looking around you can be a very first good start.
Oh my gosh, this is such a beautiful way to end the conversation. And yeah, I think people will be maybe looking out for stingless bees now a lot more once they've listened to this. So thank you so much, and for all the amazing work you do, and all of the people that you're working with and speaking on behalf of as well. Just like a massive bow.
Thank you so much, Alex. I really appreciated the time and the amazing questions too.
And so, a tiny, ancient, sometimes invisible bee living inside tree trunks in the Amazon has become the thread that connects forest health to medicinal science, to indigenous women's livelihoods, to legal rights, and to a pan-Amazon conservation corridor that's still being mapped. The deeper invitation of this episode is about what we cannot see. Rosa's work asks us to consider that the most powerful forces in living systems are often the ones we haven't yet learned to look for, and that depth is what makes conservation last. And just finally, I keep thinking that considering these bees are native across all the central tropical forests of the world, I see that what Amazon Research International is building in the Amazon is not just a local story, it's a replicable model. And so the template exists, it's being built, and the exciting global work begins. And that's it from me today. As always, thank you so much for tuning in and gifting your precious time to listening to these stories from around the world. Wishing you a wonderful day.